appropriative fashion did gain momentum in 2010, most notably by Dr. Adrienne Keene, who called out the appropriations of Native American aesthetics. Next slide. Some examples here being Urban Outfitters who that created a native inspired underwear, as well as the appropriations of Native American war bonnets, also known as feather headdresses, as Coachella festival looks. These examples display how when fashion brands create culturally inspired fashion, they have a great influential power in how these sorry, I'm a little nervous. How they take control of the cultural narrative and how they can greatly impact how the public eye perceive cultural identity through fashion. Sorry, next slide. And I wanted to clarify what is culturally inspired fashion and what is cultural clothing. So on the left-hand side here, we have an early 20th century Chinese traditional clothing, or also known as a chipa or chiangsam. As with cultural clothing, they are direct symbols of a culture and a cultural identity where their meanings and aesthetics never change. Whereas with culture inspired fashion, which is seen here on the right side in this Kim Shui piece, their meanings and aesthetics are forever changing as they align with fashion trend cycles. Oh, sorry, next slide. So, why culturally inspired fashion? As I mentioned before, cultural clothing's meanings and aesthetics, they never change. So, it is a lot easier to detect when cultural clothing is being culturally appropriated, whereas with culturally inspired fashion, it's more of a gray area as the boundaries of what is culturally appreciative and what's culturally appropriative are ill-defined. As there are many great research focusing on cultural appropriation in cultural fashion, there's scant research on culturally inspired fashion. And as these can be seen as a gateway to cultural clothing because it's easier access for public consumption, and it can be seen as an introduction to cultural clothing. Uh, as although this is considered a great tool for increasing cultural awareness, if culture inspired fashion is not designed or presented correctly, it can perpetuate negative stereotypes. Okay, next slide. So in order to conduct this exploratory study, I used a phenomenological approach to look into the perceptions of designers and consumers in regards to culture inspired fashion. As there is scant research in this topic, I conducted semi-structured interviews with the designers who create culture-inspired fashion and the consumers who buy and wear it. Through these interviews, uh, I used thematic analysis to identify patterns and themes that can provide richer description and interpretation into this phenomenon. Okay, sorry, next slide. Uh, I I interviewed two participant groups, designers and consumers. The main criteria for these participant groups were that they were millennials and U.S. citizens. As the concept of cultural appropriation has been more familiar in the past 10 years, I focus on millennials as they have grown up with these conversations and this notion, and as at the time of this study, as they were considered the most socially, culturally, and politically aware. So I felt that they had a more diverse and familiar insight and experience into this topic. I chose US citizens as the United States is a multicultural country whose residents possess dual identities, one being their American identity and the other identity connecting to their cultural heritage. Next slide. So through these interviews, four themes were identified: cultural appropriation with a subgenre of cultural awareness, fashion as a business, consumer roles in cultural inspired fashion, and fear of public outcry. Next slide. In the findings for cultural appropriation, there are three main takeaways: so transparency, authenticity, and exposure. Many of the design participants discussed how they were frustrated and struggled between creative liberty and authenticity when asked to design culture inspired fashion. Many said that they were very hesitant if they were asked by their superiors to create this, and they most of them wouldn't voluntarily create these type of collections. Consumer participants, interestingly, they said that although they wanted culture inspired fashion to have a foundation of authenticity, they didn't expect culture inspired fashion to be actually authentic. With one participant mentioning that if they wanted the original piece, they would go to the person of that culture and buy the original clothing instead of seeking it out from a fashion brand. Both designers and consumers agree that culture inspired fashion can increase cultural awareness, but there must be a balance between an authentic foundation and creative liberty. And as I have two examples that I put in this slide of what that could look like. Uh, the bottom photo here, another Kim Shui piece that is a creative interpretation of Chinese traditional clothing, and uh, this photo up above of a Keith Fuente interpretation of traditional Filipino clothing, which is the tierno, which is the sleeves. So, next slide. Both participants, fashion designers and consumers, discussed fashion as a business, where they were discussing diversity and influential power. One of the most interesting findings were that many of the design participants discuss how there is a diversity issue inside brands, meaning that there were little to no uh, designers of color within these rooms, which resulted in racial transgressions as well as a lack of understanding or experience when it came to cultural understanding or ethical integrity when it came to culture inspired designs. Another finding was that many designers discussed how the public only see designers within these design processes, whereas in reality, there's a huge, large collaboration involved, where it's not just the designers, it's also the marketers, the accountants, shareholders, CEO, where everyone has their hand in these design process. Where so ethical integrity, which could be seen in the original ideation, can get easily lost. Consumers discussed how they don't entirely trust designers or brands in general just because they feel that these designers and brands aren't being completely truthful with them regarding where they're getting these cultural inspirations from, if these cultures and questions are being credited or uh, benefiting in some way. And this was, and this type of distrust is further cemented as many of the consumers and designers uh, discussed how designers do have influential power in navigating uh, these messages through cultural inspired fashion. Okay, next slide. Although designers and consumers discuss the influential power of designers and brands, they also both agree that consumers control what they wear and buy, and they understand the context of when wearing culture inspired fashion. And what I mean is, many consumer participants discuss the line of questioning that they give themselves, where they're asking, uh, where are they wearing the culture inspired fashion to, who are they wearing it with, and why are they wearing it in the first place? This line of questioning reveals that they do understand the implications and cultural significance if they do engage in culture inspired fashion, and that they want to be mindful of the potential negative effects that uh, could happen if they do wear, if they depending if they wear this type of fashion in a out of context. Uh, both designers and consumers agree that uh, consumers do not know the entirety of the design process, meaning that the designers, they understand the where their references are coming from, the inspirations, all the way from the first stage. Whereas consumers, they only see these collections at the latter half of the process, which is already at market. So this brings a disadvantage to consumers as they may not be completely aware what references or inspirations are being put into culturally inspired fashion. So this could potentially um, be a possibility where consumers are perpetuating uh, negative messages through culturally inspired fashion. They might not even know it, or they might be wearing cultural clothing and they're not aware of it because the brands or designers either uh, didn't they had a lack of understanding or experience when they were uh, looking into these references, or they were just never disclosed to the public. Next slide. And fear of public outcry. This was the second biggest finding amongst both participant groups. What was very interesting though was although designers consumers experienced fear of public outcry or call out culture, they experienced it very differently. So with designers, the designers that interviewed for this study, they said that they personally didn't experience public outcry if their designs were seen as culturally appropriative, but they did know people within their industry that did. So witnessing this call out did cement this fear and apprehension of designing culture inspired fashion themselves. Some other interesting findings were that even if, when discussing this, even if they were called out, they mentioned how they were not, they were alarmed, but not as alarmed if they were scrutinized, uh, meaning that most designers discuss how they are already desensitized to public scrutiny and also uh, used to the pressures that they experience uh, within their companies, whether it's from their superiors, shareholders, design deadlines. So adding this added another pressure amongst their long list of pressures. It wasn't more or less more alarming. Uh, and for a lot, whereas with consumers, they experience call out culture in a more personal and direct way where if they were called out, it was directly at them, where they experienced an emotionally damaging experience if they were called out, or they feared of being called out if they were wearing culture inspired fashion. Uh, Another interesting thing was that designers they were more emotionally distanced if they were being called out if their culture inspired designs missed the mark. Whereas with consumers, they were directly reprimanded as the clothes were on their body. And next slide. So, is there a disconnect between designers and consumers regarding culture inspired fashion? As this is an exploratory study, the answer is yes and no, as this was more looking into the insights and perceptions of two ends of the spectrum of culture inspired fashion: designers who are creating this genre of fashion and the consumers who are uh, buying it and wearing it. This this looked into the full experience of how they saw the lines of cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation, where they saw the lines between creative liberty and ethical integrity. Then, oh,
Sorry to
next slide.
interrupt. We've just
Yes.
exceeded 15 minutes. So
Oh,
if you
okay.
start wrapping up, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah. Uh, Next slide. Yeah, so for suggestions for a future study, as this is more of an introductory research, this is a great opportunity for further contribution into this topic. Some suggestions would be looking into workplace dynamics of fashion brands in regards to culture inspired fashion, focusing more on fast fashion, meaning interviewing designers who work for fast fashion brands and consumers who only wear fast fashion. And lastly, replicating the study in other multicultural countries such as the UK, Canada, Australia, as well as replicating it generational with other generational attitudes. So, for instance, Gen Z. And yes, I will end the presentation there. Uh, I have the next slide is just more references. And yes, thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.